Welcome back. We're now going to spend 2 lectures examining the extraordinary view of the meaning of life that's articulated by a great contemporary leader, both in spiritual, political, philosophical affairs, the 14th Dalai Lama of Tibet, Tenzin Gyatso. Let me begin by talking a little bit about who the Dalai Lama is so that we can contextualize some of the views that we're going to be considering. The present Dalai Lama, and by the way, the term Dalai Lama isn't a name, of course, it's a title. It's a title that was conferred by Mongol rulers of Tibet in the 15th century, and our present Dalai Lama is the 14th in that lineage. It's a reincarnate lineage, which is something that Western people sometimes find a little bit surprising, so that the 14th Dalai Lama is regarded as the rebirth of the 13th Dalai Lama, who in turn is the rebirth of the 12th Dalai Lama, and so on and so forth. When a Dalai Lama dies, after a few years, a search party is sent out to try to find the rebirth, the next Dalai Lama. In the case of the present Dalai Lama, that search party found him in a very tiny village called Taktser in far northeastern Tibet in the region known as Amdo, along the Chinese border. So when he was discovered at age 4, he and his family were brought to Lhasa, to the capital of Tibet, where he received a traditional Tibetan monastic education that culminates in the Tibetan philosophical PhD or Geshe degree. So he wasn't raised by his family, but rather was raised as a monk in a monastery from the age of 4. Now, this Dalai Lama lived in times that were very challenging, very difficult, and have been very difficult for Tibet. After the victory by the People's Liberation Army in China and the establishment of communist rule in China, the Chinese government set its sights upon the conquest of Tibet with the view that Tibet had traditionally been part of China from a Chinese perspective, even though from a Tibetan perspective, Tibet was an independent country. And so shortly after the success of the Communist Revolution, Mao's troops moved on Tibet and very quickly in 1949 overran a good deal of Tibet. At age 14, the Dalai Lama, still being educated, still being groomed for leadership, was forced to confront the invasion of Tibet, a very sparsely populated and poor and unarmed country, by a very large, well-equipped and experienced army. The Tibetan people insisted that he assume leadership at that point. So at the age of 14, he became head of state and head of government of a country at war. That's a significant challenge in life. He led Tibet for about 10 years under Chinese occupation, trying to negotiate an accommodation in which Tibet would retain its cultural autonomy, its traditional cultural practices, and its religious practices under this new Chinese sovereignty. But Chinese rule tightened and became more and more oppressive, more and more difficult for Tibetans. And finally, in 1959, in March of 1959, there was a large spontaneous uprising of Tibetans against Chinese rule. It was hopeless because the Tibetans were certainly outgunned and outnumbered at that point by armed Chinese. But the suppression of the uprising was aggressive, quick, and brutal, and in fact also included an artillery attack on the residence of the Dalai Lama. So the Dalai Lama, realizing that his own life was in danger as part of the consequences of this uprising, fled Tibet in disguise and went into exile in India. Many of his followers in Tibet, hundreds of thousands, followed him into exile in India and have continued to escape from occupied Tibet right up to the present day. Right now, there's a large Tibetan exile community of a few 100,000, primarily in India, but also centered in Himalayan countries like Nepal and Bhutan, but now also a broad Tibetan exile in the West, including a substantial Tibetan community in the United States and in Europe. The Dalai Lama, after arriving in India, very quickly moved to establish a Tibetan exile leadership structure. And so a government in exile was established, headquartered right now in the tiny Himalayan town of Dharamsala, north of Delhi. The Tibetan government established schools very quickly, and some of the best schools in India, in fact, but also monastic institutions, monastic universities, some quasi-secular universities, a Tibetan medical care system, and all of the appurtenances of a government in exile. The Dalai Lama leads this government in exile as head of state, but it's important to note that he is not now head of government of the Tibetan government in exile, because a few years ago, the Dalai Lama insisted that Tibetans, if they were going to live in a modern world, needed a democratic government, and so led a commission that drafted a Tibetan constitution, which, paradoxically, against the will of most Tibetans, imposed democracy on them. So the Tibetan government now, under the head of state leadership of the Dalai Lama, has a parliamentary form of government with an independent head of government. Nonetheless, for Tibetans all around the world, and indeed for Buddhists all around the world, the Dalai Lama is recognized as an important spiritual leader, somebody to whom people turn for advice, for comment, and for leadership. The present Dalai Lama is not only informed by Buddhism. He's somebody who has always been a champion of a Gandhian account of nonviolence. He was very enamored by the work of Mohandas Gandhi, the work that we've examined, the idea of satyagraha, of insistence upon the truth, and of a refusal of violence, partly in recognition of his emphasis on democracy and his emphasis on spreading democracy through the world, and on his Gandhian nonviolence. He was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize to recognize this tremendous contribution to nonviolent struggle, not only for Tibetan independence, but his advocacy of nonviolent struggle worldwide, and his advocacy of the spread of democracy and fundamental human rights. The Dalai Lama isn't only a Buddhist and isn't only a Gandhian. These, of course, are both, as we've seen, kind of anti-modern tendencies. He's also a passionate modernist, and herein lies some of the complexity and the tension in the views that we're going to be examining in this lecture and the next. The Dalai Lama has been deeply engaged with science, primarily physics, but also cognitive science, psychology, linguistics, computer science, and neuroscience, sciences that he finds extraordinarily important. And he has argued repeatedly that, as far as he is concerned, it's the deliverances of science that tell us about the fundamental nature of reality, not classical religious scriptures. And he's repeatedly said that where Buddhism or where any religion conflicts with science, we should go with science, not with the deliverances of religion. He's also, by the way, been committed to the view that the fundamental tenets of Buddhism, though not all tenets of Buddhism, are absolutely consistent with modern science and can be enriched and informed by science, and that science can in turn be enriched and informed by Buddhism. The Dalai Lama is also a superb scholar of classical Buddhism with a very eloquent PhD, but also somebody who has studied Western philosophy very seriously and understands Western philosophy, Western religion very seriously, including Christianity, and who has written commentaries on Christian scriptures, and is somebody who is also a real scholar, as I pointed out, of science. He's the author of over 50 books. Some of these are popular books on Buddhism, some are deeply scholarly analyses of classical Buddhist texts, and some are important philosophical texts articulating his own modernist synthesis of Buddhism, democratic theory, and science. The text that I'm going to be primarily relying on in my presentation of the Dalai Lama's views is his book called Ethics for a New Millennium, published in the year 2000. So let's begin with a broad outline of the Dalai Lama's view of the meaning of life. The first thing to say is that while it is deeply inflected by Buddhism and motivated by Buddhist ideas and incorporates Buddhist ideas, he intends it and articulates it primarily as a modern secular vision, a vision that's going to have its roots in ideas of individual liberty, in freedom of speech and freedom of religion, and in democratic theory, and in the importance of science as a source of knowledge. He's going to follow Aristotle in important ways in seeing the highest good and the universal goal of human life to be happiness, and to be even understanding happiness as a broad kind of human flourishing. So we're going to see an Aristotelian emphasis in the Dalai Lama. But the Buddhist underpinnings are going to guarantee that this happiness must and can only be attained in the context of a thoroughgoing interdependence, of a recognition of the fact that all human beings and all phenomena are interdependent in all of the ways that Buddhism respects. And for the Dalai Lama, that is predominantly and preeminently going to include social interdependence. Like any Buddhist, he's going to see the problem of life as constituted by suffering, and the task of a meaningful life as the solution of the problem of suffering. But the Dalai Lama is going to follow Gandhi, and as we might also say Lame Deer, though he's never read Lame Deer, in seeing the main sources of modern suffering in consumer capitalism and industrialism. And he's going to see the sources of happiness as lying very much in purposive action in a human context, in acting in ways that we can reflectively endorse. He'll argue that acting in that way requires the cultivation of a deep sense of compassion, very much in the sense articulated by Shantideva. We'll be talking about most of the positive end of this in our next lecture, but in the present lecture, we're going to really talk about the analysis of the nature of reality that underlies the Dalai Lama's characterization of the meaningful life. So we're going to begin by talking about his view about the goal of human life, and as we're going to see, that's going to be happiness, and his argument for that will remind us a great deal of Aristotle's function argument. And we'll also see that he's got a very Aristotelian view of happiness, spelled out as a very broad sense of human flourishing. So for the Dalai Lama, the account of happiness is not going to be one set out in terms of virtue, but rather in terms of satisfaction, in terms of lack of conflict, in terms of material goods. So it's going to be a much more modern, much more familiar sense of happiness. And we'll then be talking about the components of happiness in a modern life. Let's talk a bit about happiness right now. When the Dalai Lama argues that happiness is the highest good and the goal of human life, his argument, very much as I suggested, follows Aristotle. He doesn't follow Aristotle in talking about the function of a human being. But remember these two fundamental criteria Aristotle establishes for something being the highest good or the goal of life. One is finality, and the other is self-sufficiency. That the goal of human life, the highest good, should be something for which other things are done, but is something which is never done for the sake of other things. That's the sense of finality. It's the thing we seek for its own sake, not for the sake of others. Moreover, it should be self-sufficient. We should be able to say, if we ask, is a life good? We should be able to say, it's got that quality, and not then ask what else it has. It should of itself make a life worth living. And the Dalai Lama argues that it's happiness that does that. All of us seek happiness. We don't seek happiness in order to become wealthy. We don't seek happiness in order to become powerful. We don't seek happiness in order to get anything else. Rather, we seek other things for happiness. Moreover, if I ask whether somebody led a good life, and I say, she was happy, that's enough. I don't then ask, but was she also rich? Was she also powerful? But if I say she was rich, we might ask, yes, but was she happy? She was powerful, yes, but was she happy? So for that reason, the Dalai Lama argues with Aristotle, happiness is really what we seek, and that happiness must be understood as happiness in a complete life. What are the components of happiness in a modern life? Well, they're the things that we all want, the Dalai Lama thinks. Food, adequate shelter, personal physical security, decent education, which makes everything else possible, access to health care, the opportunity for free expression of ideas, political ideas, religious ideas, artistic ideas. We want to live in a democratic order. We would like to have freedom of religion. We would like to have a certain amount of leisure and not be working all of our days. We would like to have possibilities for the kind of personal development that we find important. Now, why does the Dalai Lama think that these are the central components for happiness? Well, the reason is simple, and it also follows a kind of Aristotelian framework. He argues that in fact we see that these are universal goals. People all over the world are willing to fight and strive for democracy, not to fight in order to become oppressed. People are willing to fight and strive to attain freedom of religion. They don't fight and strive to have their freedom restricted. They might fight and strive to restrict other people's freedom, but nobody asks that their own freedom be restricted. That is something that shows that we each really value freedom, at least in our own case. People will strive for leisure. They don't strive to lead lives of unending toil, and so forth. And so it's the universality of these goals, the fact that everybody sees these as components of happiness, that the Dalai Lama thinks shows us that these really are the components of human happiness, and that this universality demonstrates the importance of these goals in our human life. Now, of course, this is a Buddhist account of the nature of reality, and so it's going to be rooted in the fundamental Buddhist doctrine of dependent origination. This is an idea that we reviewed a number of lectures ago in our lecture on the ideas of the Buddha, but it's worth reviewing them right now. When we say that things are dependently originated, or that things are all interdependent, we mean that in three very important senses, and the Dalai Lama emphasizes each of these in his analysis of the nature of human life. The first of those is causal dependence. Everything occurs as a consequence of innumerable causes and conditions, and every event produces innumerable effects. Things don't just happen. Things aren't isolated. And that means that our own actions, our own states of mind, our own emotional states, and our own values also arise dependent on innumerable causes and conditions, and everything that we do has innumerable effects. That gives us both reason to examine the world around us and to care about changing it, to care about making it the kind of world that will give rise to the kinds of lives we want, but it also forces us to attend to the actions we perform, because they are going to have ripples of effects beyond the possibility of our imagination. That's the first dimension of interdependence. Second dimension of interdependence is part-whole interdependence. Parts depend upon the wholes of which they are parts for their nature and for their functioning. Wholes, in turn, depend upon their parts in order to exist. The example that we used a while ago was the example of an automobile. We only have a fully functioning automobile in dependence upon all of its parts, its brakes, its steering wheel, its engine, its exhaust system, and so forth. But to be an exhaust system, to be a steering wheel, to be an engine, to be a brake, is to play a particular role in that whole, not simply to be shaped in a certain way, to be made out of a certain material, or to have a certain label. In human affairs, of course, this is extraordinarily important. Human institutions, universities, hospitals, communities, armies, corporations, social clubs depend upon their parts, depend upon their members for their functioning. But in order to be a member of a chess club, in order to be secretary of a town meeting, in order to be a chief of medicine at a particular hospital, in order to be professor at a university, those parts depend for their identity and for their functioning on the wholes. So we can no more reduce complex human affairs to their parts than we can reduce parts to the wholes. There's a mutual interdependence here. And finally, the third form of interdependence is dependence on conceptual imputation. That is, dependence of things for their identity, for their function, on the way in which we think about them, the way in which we name them, the way in which we reason about them. This is extraordinarily important in human affairs. So, for instance, if I imagine one of those green frog skins that Lame Deer talked about, a dollar bill, and I ask, what is it that makes that dollar bill worth $1? It's not something in the value of the paper. I could analyze the paper as long as I wanted to try to figure out whether it was worth $1. Instead, what makes it a dollar bill is the place it plays in an entire complex banking system. So it's its partness in that whole that's important. But more than that, it's the fact that we all agree to treat that dollar bill as having the value of $1, that we're willing to give 4 quarters in change for it, that we're willing to sell something whose price is $1 for it, and so forth. That's conceptual imputation. If we decided that these green frog skins were no longer going to be recognized, suppose we decided to go to dollar coins, we were only going to recognize dollar coins, not dollar bills, then no matter what part that dollar used to play, No matter how much that paper is worth, it's now worthless because we no longer impute the value $1 to it. So interdependence has all of these three dimensions: causal, part whole, and imputational. The Dalai Lama argues that interdependence, in this sense, provides us with the deepest analysis of the fundamental nature of reality. Everything around us, and in particular our own lives and the lives of the communities in which we participate, is characterized by this threefold interdependence. Moreover, he emphasizes, this is completely consistent with the deliverances of modern science, that physics demonstrates that everything is part of a uniform causal whole and interdependent in all of these ways. If you're worried about imputation, think about quantum mechanics and the role of observation in giving identity and reality to quantum phenomena. But social science and psychology also reveal that our cognitive lives, our emotional lives, and our social lives are interdependent in all three of these ways. So the Dalai Lama argues that if our actions and our lives are to be meaningful at all, they've got to be grounded in truth. They've got to be grounded in reality. Lives that are grounded in a false vision of things are just a mistake. But if it's interdependence that gives us the fundamental nature of reality, that means that a meaningful life has to be a life that responds to, is grounded in, and reflects an appreciation of interdependence. Now, of course, the Dalai Lama is not alone in this kind of insight, that meaningful lives are lives grounded in an appreciation of reality. We've seen Gandhi's idea. The meaningful life is constituted by satyagraha, grasping and insisting on truth. We've seen this idea from the Buddha, which is where the Dalai Lama gets it most forcefully, that the Four Noble Truths, or the four truths for one who would be noble, are the foundation of a meaningful life. And of course, we've also seen this idea worked out in a very different way by the Stoics, who argue that since the universe is fundamentally rational, then a recognition of that rationality is what grounds our lives as rational and hence as meaningful. Human interdependence, the Dalai Lama argues, is only a special case of this broader truth. But it's a very important special case, and it's a special case that deserves special emphasis because of the fact that what we're asking about is what is it to lead a distinctively human life, a meaningful human life. Social reality develops for us special kinds of part-whole interdependence. We're not just cars. So much of our lives are lived as members of families, employees of institutions, citizens of cities, states, nations, members of clubs, social organizations, political parties. And so much of our identity is determined by wholes of which we're a part. And so much of our responsibility to each other is helping in our participation to determine the characters of those wholes. So part-whole independence plays a very deep role in trying to understand exactly who we are and what we are. Ignore that, and you can't understand your own identity even at the beginning. Conceptual imputation, the construction of identity and roles of imputation, is also quite salient in human affairs in ways that it's not in physical affairs. When we say of somebody that they're a leader, it's because we impute to them leadership qualities. We are willing to follow them. When we say of somebody that she's a criminal, it's because we've decided that what she does is something that we don't like, and that it is our conceptuality, our assessment, that gives her that role. When we decide of somebody that they are a Nobel Prize winner, it is because somebody has conferred that prize on them. This kind of conceptual imputation, this making decisions about identity, deciding that somebody's one of us or one of them, which is often very important, is absolutely startling. Deciding that somebody is a criminal versus an adversary in war. Deciding that somebody is a colleague versus a competitor. All of these things determine the nature of our relations, the nature of our lives, the nature of our happiness, and they all depend upon this kind of social construction. Now, given that our suffering and our happiness arise out of this matrix of interdependence, each of these dimensions, causal interdependence, part-whole interdependence, the interdependence in terms of conceptual imputation, is implicated in the arising of suffering and in the production of happiness. It's my actions that can cause pleasure for others, my actions that can cause pain for others. It's my participation in a beneficial organization that can cause happiness for me and others, my participation in a criminal organization that can cause unhappiness for myself or for others, and so forth. And all of these forms of interdependence give us the possibility of having very complex effects in our actions. Everything we do ripples through societies instantly and in countless ways, and in ways that we can't always control, but demand our reflection. And so what this also generates is a set of complex obligations and responsibilities. Because our actions have so many effects, we have obligations to make sure that those effects are beneficial, and we have responsibilities to those who can be affected by our actions. So what are the sources of modern suffering, specifically the suffering that characterizes modernity and the lives that we lead? Recall the trio of sources of suffering that we examined in that first and second noble truth when we talked about the view of the Buddha. We said that suffering is rooted in confusion or ignorance about the fundamental nature of reality that gives rise to attraction to things that we want but can't have, and aversion to things that are present with us that we don't want. And so it's attraction and aversion that immediately cause suffering, but they're rooted in confusion. Modern capitalism, the Dalai Lama notes, following Gandhi very straightforwardly here, develops these three sources of suffering to new heights. Commodity fetishism, again, just as Lame Deer would have agreed, add to this. Advertising and the fetishism of objects as the sources of happiness give us this artificial creation of need. Advertising artificially creates fear of not having the best new car, creates fear of having last year's model, creates fear of being seen as wearing last year's clothes, and so being seen as some kind of a dork, right? So advertising creates both need and fear, attraction and aversion. And it isolates us in a marketplace where there's me and the commodity. And I've got to make a decision. Do I need it? And the answer is always yes. So it's this kind of engine of capitalism to create confusion and then to create attraction and aversion that the Dalai Lama thinks creates much of our modern suffering. He also thinks that this commodification infects politics as well, because it creates politicians as commodities, creates ideas as commodities, and creates confusion that then generates attraction to ideas or politicians to whom we should not be attracted, aversion sometimes from those we should. And so for this reason, the attraction and aversion that permeate our modern lives begin in confusion, and the Dalai Lama pinpoints the mass media and mass culture as sources of this kind of confusion, as well as, of course, potential sources of its opposite, that is, of knowledge, but at this point, confusion, and so as sources of suffering. He has a wonderful metaphor when he says that what we do in advertising by getting people to really want commodities, to want the newest thing, is we first create thirst, and then we offer the thirsty man a glass of salt water. Now, so much for the sources of unhappiness in the modern world. What could the sources of happiness be? Well, they're in a funny way the same things, the Dalai Lama points out. They are the interconnection with other people. This can facilitate our happiness and can constitute our happiness because it's our interconnection that enables us to work together. It enables us to produce the goods that we want, the material goods, the spiritual goods, the collective social goods. So much of that requires collective action, not something we can do individually. And so it's our interdependence that allows us to produce the goods that are constitutive of happiness. It's also our interconnectedness that allows us to discover the truth, because we can learn from each other, learn from other perspectives, integrate other ideas. Interconnection also constitutes our happiness because so much of our happiness is social. We're often happiest when we're with friends, when we're with families, when we're engaged in social activity. And we become happy when our actions actually match the goals and values we endorse, when we're living authentically in a way that Nietzsche recommended, in a way that Gandhi recommended, in a way that Lame Deer recommended. And that's often only possible socially because so many of our goals and so many of our values are collective social values. Interconnection makes happiness possible materially because a lot of the material goods we want can't be produced by us alone. Hume pointed that out, of course. And interdependence facilitates happiness in a deep constitutive way because, the Dalai Lama argues, again, following Gandhi, integrity, authenticity, leading the kind of life we could endorse is important in its own right. If we don't lead that kind of life, we are always feeling uncomfortable and self-alienated. And it's only the interdependence and the ability to interact with others that allows us to work out the kinds of social values and social ideals that we would endorse. But this kind of purposive action, the Dalai Lama argues, requires genuine compassion, karuna. And as we said when we talked about Shantideva, karuna is not an emotion, not a feeling. It's a commitment to act. The root of the word karuna is kur, meaning action. And that means that happiness in this sense, a meaningful life in this sense, according to the Dalai Lama, requires not just caring about others, but being committed in our action. And this kind of commitment to action, this kind of compassion, even though it has affective dimensions, arises as a commitment to act through the recognition and through the understanding of interdependence, and through the understanding that only in interdependence and only in compassionate action can we generate collective happiness. For that reason, the Dalai Lama thinks compassion is an absolutely essential ingredient, both of happiness for others and of happiness for ourselves. And for that reason, as we're going to see in our next lecture, karuna, compassion, the altruistic commitment to act for the welfare of other sentient beings, is going to be the foundation of a meaningful life.